I have kept the Duke's secrets for 11 years, and I intend to keep most of them to the grave. But this one I will set down, because it is not, in the end, a secret that flatters me either, and I have always believed that a man who confesses only the failures of others is not really confessing at all. My name is Edmund Farley. I have been steward of Thornecroft Hall since the winter the old Duke died and his son, Aldrich Vane, came home from the north with mud on his boots and a look in his eyes that made the underfootmen straighten without being told. I have managed the accounts, the staff rosters, the wine cellars, the correspondence with tenants, and on 2 or 3 occasions I prefer not to enumerate, the aftermath of decisions that His Grace made quickly and revised slowly. It is not a position for the faint of spirit. The Duke of Thornecroft is not a difficult man in the way that cruel men are difficult. He is difficult in the way that very certain men are difficult. The ones who have been right so often that the possibility of being wrong arrives as a genuine surprise, like snow in April, unwelcome and slightly offensive. I respected him. I still do. But I watched him make the worst mistake of his life over the course of a single dinner, and I watched him spend 2 years paying for it, and I believe the account of both things deserves to be written down somewhere honest. Marin Ashby came to Thornecroft in the employment of Lady Dorset, the Countess of Wiltham, who was Aldrich's aunt by his mother's side, and who wintered at the hall with the reliably inconvenient timing of a woman who has never had to consult anyone else's calendar. Lady Dorset was not an unkind woman, but she was exacting, and she moved through the world with the assumption that the objects in it, furniture, carriages, and companions alike, existed to be arranged around her convenience. Marin was her companion. She had held the post for 3 years when I first met her, and if the position had worn on her, she gave no outward sign of it. She was one of those people who carry stillness with them the way some carry noise. It preceded her into a room, and it remained after she left. She was perhaps 27, which in the parlance of Lady Dorset's social circle made her nearly antique for a woman without a ring, a fact the Countess felt free to observe aloud when the mood took her. Marin absorbed these observations without apparent distress. She had gray eyes that were harder to read than most people realized. They looked mild at a glance, and then you said something careless and you understood, from the brief and almost imperceptible adjustment in them, that she had registered it, catalogued it, and filed it precisely where she thought it belonged. I found her, from the beginning, far more interesting than she was credited with being. The Duke, to his later cost, did not notice her at all. Or rather, and I think this is the accurate telling, he noticed her the way a man notices a piece of furniture that is exactly where it should be and therefore requires no further attention. She was adequate. She was present. She caused no disruption. In a house the size of Thornecroft, with a household of 40 and the constant commerce of tenants and tradesmen and legal correspondence, adequate and present was a category that received no particular regard. She had been at Thornecroft for perhaps 2 weeks when the dinner occurred. It was a Thursday in November. The dining room at Thornecroft seats 24 comfortably, and the Duke used perhaps half of that capacity on the night in question. Lady Dorset, 3 neighboring families of standing, a pair of Aldrich's old friends from his northern posting, and a retired clergyman who had been invited because he played chess, and the Duke had been in the mood for an opponent. Marin sat at the far end of the table in her customary position beside Lady Dorset, which put her roughly at the same social altitude as the salt cellar, present, serviceable, not to be addressed directly unless the Countess required something fetched or confirmed. I was not at the table. I do not dine with the family. But I have been at Thornecroft long enough to know the shape of events from the account of 6 different witnesses, and the 6 accounts I received were consistent enough that I believe what follows is close to what actually happened. The conversation at the table had turned, as it frequently turned in those years, to the question of what was to be done about the northern landholdings. The Duke had opinions, his friends had other opinions, and the neighboring families listened and occasionally contributed remarks designed primarily to demonstrate that they were paying attention. At some point during the third course, Marin said something. I was told later that she did not speak out of turn, exactly. Lady Dorset had addressed her, a clarifying question about a letter they had read that morning regarding a tenant dispute in the Eastern Quarter, a matter on which Marin had done some of the correspondence. Marin answered, precisely and briefly, and then, perhaps because the silence invited it, offered one additional observation, something to the effect that the northern tenants had raised the same concern through 3 separate letters over 18 months, and that the pattern suggested a structural issue rather than a seasonal one. It was accurate, I know because I verified it afterward. The pattern was precisely what she said it was, and the Duke's land agent had been, through a combination of optimism and administrative overload, consistently reassuring everyone that it would resolve itself. Aldrich looked up from his wine. He did not say anything cruel. I want to be clear on that because this is not a story about a cruel man. He looked at her from his end of the table to hers, and said something to the effect that Miss Ashby was very kind to share her observations, and that he was sure Lady Dorset found her invaluable, and then he returned his attention to the man beside him and continued the previous conversation as though nothing had been interrupted, because to him, nothing had. He was not dismissing her in the way a man dismisses a challenge. He was dismissing her in the way a man dismisses a sound from the kitchen. It was simply not, to him, a voice that required a response. That is the thing about indifference. It is not dramatic enough to argue with. Marin, I was told, finished her dessert without any change in expression. She assisted Lady Dorset from the table at the appropriate time, said good evening to the room at large, and went upstairs. 2 of the neighboring wives exchanged a look. The clergyman appeared not to have noticed. The Duke's friends discussed the wine. I learned the next morning that she was gone. She had packed in the small hours, not everything, because there was a trunk of the Countess's winter things that she could not in good conscience take, and she had left a letter for Lady Dorset that was, by the Countess's pale-faced account of it, impeccably worded and entirely unimpeachable. She had secured a reference before leaving Derbyshire, from a former employer whose family had spoken well of her, and she had already arranged through correspondence a post as a schoolmistress in Aldwick, a market town in the grey-stoned western part of the county that was approximately 19 miles from Thornecroft Hall and approximately 19 miles, I think, from anything she had found in this house worth staying for. She left no message for the Duke. This was not an oversight. Lady Dorset was in a state for 3 days. She required a new companion, required it immediately, had no idea how one found a person who could manage correspondence and sit through dinners and read aloud without making a production of the consonants, all at once, and in this she was not entirely wrong. Marin had been good at her work. The Countess had simply not found a way to say so while she was present, which is a failure of character that many people share and almost nobody corrects in time. Aldrich was informed of the departure. I informed him myself on the Friday morning when I presented the usual household summary. He listened. He said he was sorry for the inconvenience to his aunt, and he hoped Miss Ashby had found suitable arrangements. I said she had. He said good and returned to the correspondence on his desk, and I took my leave, and that was the end of it. For about 6 weeks. I noticed the first sign at the end of November. He asked me, in the middle of a conversation about the Southfield drainage, whether I happened to know if Lady Dorset had found a replacement companion. I said she had engaged a Miss Prentice from Bath, who seemed competent. He said good. Then he said, with the careful casualness of a man who has rehearsed the question, whether I knew what position Miss Ashby had taken. I said I understood she was schoolmistressing in Aldwick. He said nothing further and returned to the drainage, and I did not indicate by any shift of expression that I had noticed anything, because it is part of my function not to notice things until I am meant to. December passed. He worked hard. He rode when the weather allowed and managed the estate with his usual decisiveness and slept. I noted from the patterns of the household, the late candles, the early bells, rather less than he usually did. He was not unwell. He was not visibly distressed. He was simply a man who had misplaced something and was not yet willing to say so aloud. January, February. He snapped at the head groom once, which was unusual. Aldrich was not a man who snapped at staff, in the ordinary way. He was exacting and he had standards, but he delivered corrections with a certain cool precision that the staff found, if not comfortable, at least navigable. The snap surprised everyone, including the Duke himself. He apologized the following morning, which I believe was the first time in my 11 years that I had witnessed him apologize to anyone below the rank of baronet. In March he asked me whether the school in Aldwick was the one managed by the parish or the one managed by the Mechanics' Institute, and I said I was not entirely certain but I could find out, and he said no. It was not important, and I said of course, and I found out anyway because it is my nature to have information available before it is required. It was the parish school. I noted this and said nothing. By April I had begun to understand the shape of what was happening, and I want to say plainly that it was not a comfortable shape to watch. Aldrich Vane was a man who had never, to my observation, been uncertain about anything for longer than 20 minutes. Decisions arrived in him like whether sudden, total, and conclusive. He was not built for the long, slow erosion of a thing he had not known he wanted until it was already gone, and it was doing him no credit. He was shorter in his temper than usual, longer at his desk than was sensible, and he had developed a habit. I first noticed it in late February, and it persisted, of sitting in the east corridor after the household retired, in the chair nearest the window, which was the chair Marin had occupied on the 2 or 3 evenings when the Countess had asked her to wait with the letters while Lady Dorset played cards. I do not know whether he was aware of this. I chose not to speculate. In May, he told me. He did not intend to. We were reviewing the accounts for the spring quarter, and he was signing correspondence, and I had just reported that the tenant dispute in the northern quarter had, as projected, proven to be a structural issue rather than a seasonal one. The land agent had finally submitted a full assessment confirming the same, and Aldrich put down his pen and looked at the window for a moment, and then said, as though the thought had simply surfaced without permission, that he had behaved like a fool in November. I said nothing, because I have learned that the correct response to a man confessing is silence. He said he had not intended to be dismissive. He had not thought of it at the time as dismissal. He said the worst part of it was that she had been entirely right about the northern tenants, and that he had known she was right more or less the moment she said it. But he had been in the middle of a dinner with people he wanted to impress, and the ease of the evening had seemed more important than attending to a companion at the far end of the table who was saying something accurate. He said this with his eyes on the window and his hands flat on the desk, and he said it quietly, the way men say things they have been carrying for some time. I said I thought that was an honest account of it, Your Grace. He said he did not know what he was going to do about it. I did not offer suggestions because he had not asked for them, and because I knew from 11 years of service that Aldrich Vane moved toward his own decisions in his own time and did not benefit from being guided. But I will admit that I thought, he is going to go to Aldwick. He will let the summer pass because he is proud, and then he will go. And when he goes, I hope she makes him wait. I hope she makes him sit in an uncomfortable chair in a cold room and explain himself in full, without the safety of a polished table and a wine glass between them. I hope it costs him something. Not because I wished him ill, I did not, and do not, but because I thought, and still think, that certain things are only truly understood through discomfort, and the Duke of Thornecroft had been comfortable for a very long time. I was not wrong. He let the summer pass. He went to Aldwick in October. He did not tell me in advance. He told me afterward, which is how I know it was not arranged in his mind as a formal expedition, but arrived on a Tuesday morning as one of those decisive weather moments, sudden and total, and was acted upon before he had the opportunity to talk himself into a more dignified approach. He took his own horse. He did not take a footman. He arrived at the parish school at 10:15 in the morning, and he stood in the doorway of a room that smelled of chalk and wool and the particular damp of autumn stone. And she was at the blackboard with her back to him, working through a column of figures with a class of 14 children between the ages of 6 and 11. He waited in the doorway. He had not been prepared for the specific quality of the waiting, the children who turned to look at him and then looked at her for guidance, and her back, which did not turn, which continued with the column of figures until it was done, and then turned very deliberately toward the class and said, in a voice that indicated nothing unusual, that they might work the next 3 problems on their slates while she attended to a visitor. She looked at him then. I have reconstructed this from what he told me, and from what I know of her, and I believe I have it reasonably right. She did not look surprised. She did not look pleased. She looked at him with those gray eyes that were harder to read than they appeared, and she said, "Good morning, Your Grace," which was the most dangerous possible greeting, because it acknowledged him entirely and welcomed him not at all. He said good morning. He said he was sorry to interrupt the lesson. She said it was not an interruption and waited, which meant that it was, and that she intended him to know it. He said he had come because he owed her an apology, and that he was aware of how late it was, and he said her name Marin, which was the first time. He realized as he said it that he had used it. He had addressed her in the whole of her time at Thornecroft as Miss Ashby, which is correct form, and not wrong, except that it meant he had never once used the name she actually answered to, and he felt the weight of this as a kind of evidence against himself. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the children who were not working the problems. She said to the room that they would take a quarter-hour recess in the yard. The room cleared with the vigorous efficiency of children who have learned that a quiet voice and a precise instruction are not to be tested. When they were alone, she did not invite him to sit, because there was only one chair in the room that was adult-sized, and it was hers, and she took it, and so he stood, which he later told me he thought was probably correct. He said it felt right that he should stand. He said he had been sitting down for 11 months, and it had not improved his understanding of anything. He told her what he had told me in May, or a version of it, that he had not been deliberately cruel, which he knew did not absolve him of anything, because the absence of cruelty is not the same as the presence of regard, and what he had offered her at that table was neither. He said he had known she was right about the northern tenants as she said it, and that knowing had not made him respond, and he was not sure what that said about him, but he did not think it said anything flattering. He said he had sat in the East Corridor in the evenings for longer than he was comfortable admitting, in the chair she used to sit in, which was an absurd thing to tell her, but he found he was not interested in protecting his own dignity any further than it had already protected him, which was not, on balance, very far. She listened to all of this. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, which was how she had sat through 6 seasons of Lady Dorset's commentary and 2 years of Thornecroft's periphery, and she looked at him with those careful gray eyes, and she did not fill the silence when he finished, which meant he had to sit in it, except that he was still standing. Then she said, "I want to know what you are asking for, Your Grace, because I find that I have a limited tolerance for eloquent uncertainty at this stage of the proceedings." He said very directly that he was asking her to come back, not to Lady Dorset's employ, which he could not arrange even if he wished to, but to the hall. He said he was not sure what the correct form of the arrangement was, and he was prepared to be guided on that, but he was asking her to come back, and he was asking with the understanding that whatever she agreed to would be on her terms, because the only terms that had been operative previously had been his, and they had proven to be, on reflection, insufficient. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "And the school?" He said he had been wondering about that on the way over. He said the schoolroom in Aldwick needed a new roof. He could see this from the yard, and the parish managed it on very little, and he had been thinking that this was a problem he could perhaps address, if that would be of any interest. He said this carefully because he understood the risk of it, that it could be heard as a bribe, or as a man's instinctive reach for the thing he knew how to do, which was to use his resources to resolve a difficulty. He said he was not offering it as a condition of anything. He was offering it because she was good at this, and the children were sitting on benches that had seen better decades, and it seemed wrong to him that she had come 19 miles from his house to teach in a cold room with a leaking roof when he had resources that could make it otherwise. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "The roof, the benches, and a proper stove for the winter." He said, "Yes." She said, "And my position at the hall, if I agree to return, is a matter of independent negotiation and has no bearing on the school, which will be put in repair regardless." He said, "Yes, absolutely." She said, "Then I will hear your proposal." And he made one. I do not know all the particulars, because this is where his account became somewhat general, which I took to mean that what passed between them in the next 20 minutes was of a nature that belonged to them, and not to the record. What I know is that she asked several questions, and he answered them without deflection, which I believe was new for him, and that at some point in the exchange something shifted in the room, not dramatically, not with announcement, but in the way that the atmosphere of a room shifts when the weather turns from gray to clear, without any single moment that you can point to and say, "There, that was it, that was when." She said she would think on it until the end of the week, and he said that was reasonable, and she said good, and then she went to the door of the yard and told the children they might come back in. He walked past 14 children in various states of outdoor dishevelment, none of whom were particularly impressed by him, which I think was also probably correct and possibly good for his character. He rode back to Thornecroft in less than 2 hours, which is fast for 19 miles, and he did not say anything to me when he arrived, except to ask that I find out who the parish contacted about roofing contracts and have them call at the hall at my convenience. He looked, I noted, without saying so, like a man who had been permitted, tentatively and on conditions yet to be finalized, to breathe. She wrote on the Friday. The letter was addressed to me, not to him, which I found characteristic and correct. She was negotiating a position, and she was negotiating it as a professional with the person who managed professional arrangements at the hall, which was her right and her intelligence, and I respected it. She set out her terms in 3 paragraphs, in handwriting that was clear and unhurried, without flourish and without apology. She was precise about what she would and would not do. She was precise about what she required. She was not unkind. I took the letter to the Duke. He read it. He made one mark in the margin, which was an increase to a figure she had proposed, not a decrease, and handed it back to me and said, "As she has written, plus the amendment, send her the formal letter today." He was in the east corridor that evening, in the chair by the window, and for the first time in 11 months, the quality of his sitting in it was different. Not the sitting of a man who is waiting for something he is afraid has gone permanently, but the sitting of a man who is waiting for something that has agreed, in principle and on its own terms, to come back. She arrived on the following Wednesday. She arrived without ceremony, in a hired coach, with 2 trunks and a crate of books, and the particular self-possession of a woman who has moved into and out of enough households to know that the first impression you make on arrival is the one the staff keep. She greeted me by name, thanked me for the correspondence, asked where she was to be housed, and then, when I had shown her the rooms, which were good rooms, on the 2nd floor with a window facing the park, she stood in the doorway and looked at them for a moment and said, "These are very good rooms, Mr. Farley." I said, "The Duke's instruction, Miss Ashby." She said nothing to that, but she looked at the rooms with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite not one, and then she unpacked her books first, which I found entirely consistent. She met the Duke that evening formally in the West drawing room. I was present for the initial 5 minutes, as propriety required, and then removed myself on a pretext of household business, as propriety also allows if one is judicious about the timing. I did not hear what passed between them. I did not attempt to. But when I returned 40 minutes later to ensure the tea things were cleared, they were still in the room, and the fire had been built up from its earlier modest state, and they were talking not tentatively, not with the careful measurement of people who have something to prove, but with the ease of two people who have already said the difficult things and are discovering, to their mutual mild astonishment, that there is a great deal left to say. I cleared the tea things. I wished them both a good evening. The Duke said good evening, Edmund, without looking away from the conversation. Marin said good evening, Mr. Farley, in a tone that I took with some private satisfaction to mean, yes, this is going well, but you are not required to witness it. I left them to it. I will not pretend to know exactly what was agreed in the months that followed, because it is not the kind of thing one asks a duke and still expects to remain employed. What I can say is that the East Corridor chair returned to its ordinary function of holding coats in the winter, that the Duke's sleeping hours normalized by December, that the snap at the headgroom was not repeated, and that the parish school in Aldwych received, in the November of that same year, a new roof, new benches, a proper stove, and a set of slates for every child enrolled. From an anonymous benefactor, whose handwriting the schoolmistress who remained in residence there 4 days a week claimed not to recognize, which I understood to be a diplomatic untruth of the most graceful variety. Marin Ashby remained at Thornecroft, in the rooms with the window facing the park, and in the rooms adjacent to them when certain arrangements were later formalized, and she continued to ride out to Aldwych twice a week even after those arrangements were formalized, because she had made it a condition, and because the Duke had agreed to the condition without hesitation, and because, as he said to me once, on one of the mornings I caught him reading her letters at the breakfast table with an expression that a less discreet steward might have commented upon. As he said, she was right about the school as she had been right about the northern tenants, and he had found that attending to what she was right about was proving to be, on balance, the most useful thing he had done in the whole of his tenure. I said, I believe that is a considerable thing to admit, Your Grace. He said, yes, well, I have had practice. I did not say anything further. It was not required. I have kept the Duke's secrets for 11 years, and I intend to keep most of them to the grave. But this one I set down because it seems to me that there are a great many stories told about men like Aldrich Vane, powerful men, certain men, men who fill a room the way a banked fire fills it, with heat and the suggestion of something that could, if required, be considerably more. And in most of those stories the woman they love is a prize that is claimed, a difficulty that is overcome, a softness that domesticates them. I do not think that is the right shape of this one. Marin Ashby left Thornecroft in the small hours of a November morning, because she valued herself at a rate that the household at that time did not match. She spent a year teaching children arithmetic in a cold room with a leaking roof, because the cold room was hers, and the choice was hers, and no amount of Thornecroft's comfort was worth the alternative. And when the Duke of Thornecroft arrived in her doorway and stood, for a change, and explained himself, she listened, and asked good questions, and negotiated clearly, and agreed on her terms and returned. She did not need to be rescued. She was not incomplete without him. She was a woman who had looked at what was being offered, found it wanting, walked out with her things in good order, built something worth staying in, and then, when the offering improved substantially and on her conditions, made a considered decision to stay. That, I think, is the whole of it. Aldrich Vane will tell you, if you ask him on a day when his guard is not entirely in order, that the best decision of his life was made in a cold schoolroom in Aldwych, standing in front of a woman who had folded her hands in her lap and was waiting without urgency for him to say something worth hearing. I would not correct him on this. I would only add for the record that the second best decision was the increased figure in the margin of the letter, and that I knew, when he handed it back to me without comment, that he was going to be all right. Title paste into title, txt. The Duke's steward swore he would never speak of it, but the night she walked out, everything changed. Title tracker, append this row to title tracker, txt. 59-2026-0727. The Duke's steward swore he would never speak of it, but the night she walked out, everything changed. G1, walk away, right arrow he breaks. Self-contained lady's companion who leaves without a word. She hears him out in her own schoolroom and grants yes on her terms. No fixed number span the engine. G, dignified, walk away, right arrow he breaks. DNA G1. Hinge equals M dash plus curiosity tail. Payoff equals she grants yes on her own terms in her own space. Heroine equals lady's companion / Marin Ashby. Narrator equals male witness Edmund Farley, Duke's steward of 11 years, first person. Setting equals Thornecroft Hall, Wiltshire / East Corridor / Parish School in Aldwick. Rotated off female heroine narrator off Caldenmere / Derbyshire / Ashwick. FLAGS for 60. Rotate engine off G. Rotate off male witness narrator. Very setting off Wiltshire / Aldwick. Very heroine off lady's companion. Very hinge off curiosity tale. Very opening word off the. Story variety tracker. Append this row to story variety tracker, txt. 59-2026-0727. The Duke's steward swore he would never speak of it, but the night she walked out, everything changed. G, dignified, walk away, right arrow he breaks. Male witness, Edmund Farley, Duke's steward of 11 years. First person, Marin Ashby, lady's companion, self-contained, reads people with quiet precision. Warm only to those who earn it, she was dismissed by indifference, not cruelty, passed over at dinner without remark. She packed in silence and was gone by morning. Aldrich Vane, Duke of Thornecroft, decisive, magnetic, used to being obeyed, unravels slowly when the one person he wanted to impress is the only one who left Thornecroft Hall, Wiltshire, East Corridor, West Drawing Room, and a grey-stoned parish school in Aldwick. She agrees on her terms. The school is put in repair regardless. The rooms with the window facing the park become hers, wry, restrained, quietly confessional, the loyalty of a steward watching his employer make, and then slowly correct the finest mistake of his life. Band trope used. No FLAGS for 60. Rotate engine off G. Rotate off male witness narrator. Very setting off Wiltshire / Aldwick. Very heroine off lady's companion. Very hinge off curiosity tale. Very opening word off the.